wooden partitions, laminates, veneers.
Absolutely.
Right.
Cabinets, cabinets and furnitures. So this formaldehyde is actually not so good for us. It is a carcinogen. Formaldehyde can cause irritation of the skin, eyes, nose, and throat. High levels of exposure would lead to some types of cancer. How do you remove that from the indoor spaces? So here we are talking about ventilation. It's a simple strategy. We've all been doing it for, I suppose, hundreds of years, right? If something is smelling funny, if something is odorous, what did our ancestors do? What did our grandmothers, grandfathers do? Open the windows. Now, this may lead to another question. I'm sure it's on your mind, especially in places like Delhi. We'll come to that in a minute. But the fundamental question you want to address here is if there is a buildup of contaminants in the indoor space where we occupy, one way to do is ventilation. You're going to get it out of the air in the room. Other contaminants like PM 2.5, the small particles, right? Again, the way to address that will be, if I can see the particle in the air, I shouldn't be too concerned about it, because my respiratory system is going to filter out and block it's the small size particles, what we call the PM 2.5 microns, that are in the air that we can't see. It'll just go through our respiratory system, the process, and they get into our lungs, and that can cause a lot of respiratory related symptoms or issues. People can catch upper respiratory infection, and they can have issues related to the PM particles, the small size particles, impacting the whole process of respiration. When it comes to indoor air quality, there's something called source control. If we can remove it. The next strategy is exposure control. Remember the inhalation, exhalation that each of us go through. That exposure to the contaminants, if we can mitigate it, then that's the more practical way. In fact, that is a hierarchical way, source control followed by exposure control. Ventilation is part of the exposure control strategy. Now, I fully understand the very high temperatures in Delhi at this time, and I would never advocate opening the windows at that time. However, having said that, there would be times when you would want to open the windows or ventilation, bring in ventilation somehow through a mechanical system, if that's possible in commercial building, that's what they do. The reason being, the outdoor air being polluted is primarily of the PM contaminant, PM 2.5 and even lower. Maybe some gaseous contaminants related to some of the exhaust fuel emissions, NOx,
vehicular emissions and everything,
this kind of things. But there are sources of contaminants indoors that we constantly are exposed to, and if that's not diluted, it's got nothing to do with the outdoor air. It's things that we have inside. Remember the carpets, remember the furnitures, remember the cabinets, remember some of our human activities too. So these are things that are going to contribute to indoor air pollution unless you remove that at source, which means when it comes to human activities, the humans should be out of that space. But that's not practical. We are talking about all of this for the people there. So people have to be there. Their activities has to happen. If that were to be the case, then we got to think in terms of diluting or removing the indoor contaminants, and ventilation is a very effective way of doing it. Now, if let's say we go with the argument, I can't open the windows because it's too polluted outside, it's too hot outside, and I want to seal everything, we're making the room more tighter, airtight. That means the build of contaminants is going to take even quicker. In very short time, the levels will be very, very high. So there are certain things you can do if you can't dilute the air, in the contaminated air, you can clean the air. So here comes the questions of air cleaners that have been, widely discussed about during the pandemic, and even now we do see it as a viable strategy. So you can clean the indoor air of certain contaminants, not all. That's the important thing to understand. We can remove the particulate matter, we can remove some of the gaseous contaminants, but you can't remove everything. And not everyone is going to have an air cleaner in their house all the time. And there are, we have to be mindful of what the air cleaners themselves are doing. Are they creating new contaminants? Are they causing more problems for us in the final analysis? So it's a much broader technical discussion that needs to be properly had. So that's where the problem is in terms of too hot outside, too polluted. I don't want to open the windows. I would still maintain. What about the winter times in places like Delhi? They're talking about the air is not so cold outside, but it's polluted. So the polluted air needs to be cleaned before it can come in. So when I talk about outdoor air for dilution or bring the outside air, it is implied that that air has to be cleaned to some level. If it is extremely polluted, we would need some, I suppose in this case, you can see it as a technical installation. Maybe on the window, there is a small gadget that can be seen as a fan filter unit. So the fan is drawing the air from outside, blowing it indoor into the room. And there is a HEPA filter. So ventilation is not something we can avoid. It is a very important part of the whole game. It has to be seen as an important part of the whole game. We don't have too many things from a ventilation perspective.
Yeah, it's just everybody's running on split ACs, and that is causing more concern.
Split system does not have any ventilation. It's just recycling the room air.
Thank you so much for saying that. I wanted someone to say this aloud.
So the only thing that people feel, which I think is more, like a myth.
Psychological.
There is some air leaking in from the leakages under the door, window panel.
Infiltration.
But you just said yourself, people want the windows to be airtight, the doors to be airtight. You want to create almost like a completely sealed room. And if we are sitting there or working there, you can't have ventilation. You cannot have dilution using split system units. They are basically recirculating, using the recirculated air. So that's a big concern, right? So it will not do it. So if we want any ventilation in such application, it requires a new thinking. Maybe it's a different mechanical ventilation design and installation to that particular room or house or whatever. It then goes back to how commercial buildings are done. In commercial buildings, I guess the air handling units will have properly designed ventilation pathway. For homes, we just don't have that. Typically in India, even in Singapore for that matter, our residential buildings, we don't have ventilation if we are using the split system units. I have cross ventilation. It's a very simple word, very effective. It's a very effective word. That's what we want. The quick, simple, easy, effective way is ventilate, cross ventilate. Okay. If you have a room that has split system installation and there is no ventilation happening at this time, mechanical ventilation, a new installation is a good idea. Let's say even that is not viable, not practical for whatever reason, then the approach ought to be one of don't use the split system continuously for long periods of time. So it is a little bit like what I would call as every certain number of hours you may want to consider opening the windows and cross ventilating it.
How do we look into the future? As in, are there any emerging contaminants or any latest research in this field that people should be aware of? I mean, is there something very serious knocking at our doors that we are not aware of?
Example, ozone, for instance. In some places,
I'm wanting to talk about it. Yeah.
In some places it is ubiquitous. It is just there all the time, even in the outdoor air. So when we get the outdoor air into the building, we have to ensure that the ozone is mitigated. So there are requirements that come from standards and codes related to that. So the point I'm trying to make here is ozone. when it is present in the same environment as, say, the VOCs, ozone and the chemical compounds can react, and
Oh,
the
okay.
output, the products of such reaction will be what we call
Hmm.
fine particles, secondary aerosols or fine particles that then come into the particulate matter problem that we spoke about earlier, but in an even lower particle size. In other words, it can go in
Okay.
even freely. So this
Hmm.
new emerging, it's I'm saying it as an emerging science or emerging understanding, but it's been there for about 10 plus years at least. The domain, we call it indoor chemistry. Ozone
Chemistry. Okay.
reacting with VOCs to produce certain byproducts that are not good for us. So, would you handle ozone separately? Would you handle VOC separately? And would you then handle the products of the byproducts? Why not
Separately. Okay.
eliminate one or the or both? Mitigate ozone, eliminate it if possible. Mitigate VOCs, eliminate it if possible. But if we have done all our best and we still think that some level of these contaminants are going to exist there, then we need to be mindful of such byproducts. Touch wood, it doesn't happen, but should there be another pandemic or an epidemic in the future, and we are concerned about pathogens in the indoor environment, how do we handle it? How do we handle it from the building systems perspective, from the heat HVAC as we would call it, or the air conditioning systems in that context? We would still need to be mindful of ventilation from outdoor air, but now I think a strong focus is added to indoor air cleaning. So there are new standards that we are now talking about from ASHRAE and other, parts where we are seeing air cleaning as an important mitigation strategy along with ventilation. So you will have to use a combination of both.
Combination of
That
both.
is the new standard from ASHRAE. I am part of that standard. It just was released last June
Oh,
2023.
I don't know if how many people know this, but photocopiers and all these printers, they emit a lot of ozone. And that still, I don't think is talked about a lot in, I'm just talking about the general architects and interior designers fraternity. Of course, you are an expert, you will always talk about it all the time, but just talking to my fellow architects and fellow industry folks that we don't talk a lot about ozone. Why is that?
No, I think we should be mindful of what happens with certain devices that we use. So photocopiers, yes, they can and they do emit ozone, but the levels may be depend, right? It depends on the
Not
particular
very hazardous.
looking
Yeah.
at. So we need to know and be mindful that it can emit, and then are the levels low enough so that we can still continue using it. So right from the very early days that I've been involved in this field, we have always said if there are specific sources that can contribute to a particular contaminant, then they should have their own exhaust provision, or we put it in the return pathway of the air distribution.
That my architect friends need to take a note of as to where to place these hazardous ozone emitting, when we talk about space planning. So how to take care about that.
Really an architectural discussion about space planning, and if it is really,
Yeah.
it's a little bit like in all the airports and a lot of hotels, they would say smoking is prohibited only in designated smoking zones, right?
Yes.